Okay, recording. So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Julia Zamit, and I'm the Social Policy Commissioner of KSU, and I shall be moderating today's panel discussion. As individuals' right to vote, this being a fundamental human right together with a democratic responsibility, this is one of the most critical ways that individuals can influence governmental decision-making, and elections offer an opportunity to exercise one's civic duty. It can be said that this year's US presidential election has been a topic of discussion not only in the United States, but also internationally, together with the fact that the US president not only has an influence on US citizens, but also has an influence on foreign affairs, with this being one of the main reasons for today's discussion. Thus, with this, I would like to introduce today's panelists, Dr. George Vital Zamit, a senior lecturer within the Department of Public Policy within the Faculty of Economics, Management and Accountancy at the University of Malta, Mr. Robert Micallef, also a lecturer within the Department of Public Policy within the Faculty of Economics, Management and Accountancy at the University of Malta, and Dr. Valentina Kassar, a lecturer within the Department of International Relations within Faculty of Arts at the University of Malta. Welcome all and thank you for joining us this evening. To begin,
Thank you, KSU. Thank you, Julia, for the invitation.
Thank you.
Same here. Many thanks.
Economically or politically, socially, how has the USA changed since 2016? And in your opinions, are Americans better off?
Okay, shall I start?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, okay. Well, first of all, Julia, I think this is a bit of a watershed moment in the history of American politics, because you have what may have been probably the most unusual, uncommon leader to ever occupy the White House. He ran on an anti-establishment ticket. And I think he was actually an anti-establishment. The problem with any candidate in politics running as being an anti-establishment is always the same one, is that in a few years you actually become part of the establishment. So that remains always a bit of an idealistic slogan. But your question is, how has America changed? I think America, and you mentioned three pillars: economic, social, and political. I would take the latter one and its significance in the international arena. I think the United States has receded, has withdrawn from being a leader in the international community. Being a leader is not just about having the biggest military, being the biggest budget spender when it comes to defense, having a space force, as we now have. Being a leader means also taking stands when it comes to humanitarian issues, environmental issues. And that hasn't been the case for the past 4 years. So definitely, whereas we were used to the United States taking a leading role in these issues, this has not been the case. As a matter of fact, it's not me saying it, it's European leaders who have quite unequivocally a number of times stated this in international fora, and this I think was quite prominent. You mentioned socially. Socially, I would say the United States has still a number of social rifts within its society, and you can't blame those on Donald Trump. As a matter of fact, we have seen that a number of wounds have not been healed yet. What I would add is probably that during the Trump presidency, these wounds have been opened even further. So we have seen race riots again. We have seen protests against police brutality. And we have seen also people actually having very mixed reactions when it comes to the pandemic. I guess we would come to this later on. I would touch the last one, not to take a lot of time in my first intervention. You mentioned economically. Economically, the United States has been hit like the rest of the international community due to the pandemic. And if that is not something which you can blame on the president, you can perhaps blame on his type of response and his attitude on the way the United States has actually reacted to that. But actually, the United States has lost millions of jobs. And whereas the attempt has been to impose less taxes on the richest segment of society, the lower segment of society doesn't seem to have benefited at all, especially when you consider the fact that millions and more millions have now lost their private medical insurance. So yes, Julia, you touched on three particular pillars, and I think all of them have in some way been impacted during the past 4 years.
I think if I had to jump in, I think I agree with George with regards to his comments on US international leadership, and that the United States over the past 4 years and under Trump has taken quite a remarkable, if not step back, but a remarkable tone and attitude adjustment, if you will, when it comes to the United States sort of retreat, if you will, from the extent to which it's willing to participate and, as he said, take the lead within the international community. I think it has to be said, though, that this is a trend that has been long underway in the United States. And this is a pattern and a tendency that has always been inherent in US foreign policy since, before the First World War. We saw the United States that was reluctant to get engaged and embroiled in the squabbles and the issues that the Europeans or the rest of the international community was engaged in. And after the end of the Cold War, during a period where the United States had really taken on the lead and taken on the mantle of leadership, I think what we've seen over the past 30 years or so is the struggle within the United States, that it feels it is obliged to maintain the international order that it created, but it has for a long time wanted to take a step back. And we even saw this under the Obama administration, where he talked about leading from behind within international affairs. But yes, I think the Trump administration has really readjusted the tone and the extent to which it's willing to act upon its reservations about its engagements within the international system. So if we look at climate change, world trade, world health, the Iran nuclear deal, and so many other issues. I think economically, yes, the United States pre-COVID, if I had to talk pre-COVID, was economically doing well. And the Trump administration was making good on many of its promises. We're seeing economic growth, drastic tax cuts, lower unemployment figures, the renegotiation of trade deals, which would be supposedly more favorable to the United States. So these were factors which saw the Trump administration doing rather well. I think when we look at, politically and socially within the United States, I think the Trump administration has been in part sort of fueling, but it's also a sort of a symptom of trends that have been inherent within US politics over the past couple of years, but even at an international level. We're seeing sort of a move towards the fringes, right? And sort of extreme sentiments being expressed within international politics. We're seeing sort of less of a patience, both at a public and a political level, with being diplomatically correct and saying it as it is. And Trump has ridden on that, and he appeals to that. And this is what gives him a lot of support within his domestic audience. And it's something that you either love Trump for, and I think a lot of voters love Trump for that, but there are a lot of voters who are obviously put off and turned away by his type of rhetoric. Then you have people who are in between who say, listen, I'm not a fan of his tweets and the way he talks about certain issues and certain things, but I do like his policies, and that he then has been consistent with what we usually expect out of a Republican administration. I think what we have to see is the fact that this is a mid-pandemic election. And is that going to change the ball game? Is that going to change the criteria that we usually use to judge and to try to preempt and predict and analyze the way voters behave and the way voters assess their governments at the end of the day?
Mr. McAuliffe, would you like to?
Yes, economically, I would say there have been mixed results. I mean, of course, there's a pandemic now. It's a pandemic that has gone out of control, and it has had a huge impact on the economy. But overall, if you look at the 4 years of the Trump administration, we've had long periods of consumer confidence and, positive business perceptions and confidence. Having said that, the budget deficit has been going up and the national debt has also been going up. And now, of course, although there are forecasts about the US getting out of the current recession, I think that the projections are a bit too optimistic, mostly because of the consequences of the pandemic. So economically, it has been mixed. Although if we look at the GDP, it has averaged about 2.7% since Trump took over. Sorry about that. And that compares positively with the approximate 1.6% gain the US had before Trump took over. So let's see. It's a difficult time for the US, and economically, I think it's that's one of the key elements that we have to look at. In terms of foreign affairs, we've had some changes. I think the security tensions in Asia have increased during the Trump administration, mostly because of the concerns about China. The relations with Russia have been complicated even more. On NATO, although Trump had been very critical of NATO, despite the fact that NATO was a cornerstone of American foreign policy for many years, Trump had said that it was obsolete, although he changed his mind on this. And in fact, we've seen that there has been more emphasis on NATO. Some skeptics would say that the original negative talk by Trump about NATO was only to get the allies to pay their part and to contribute more financially to the organization, which they have done. So I think one thing that we have to remember, we have to look at the moment, is the fact that the US has to readjust its place in the world. It's no longer a bipolar world. It's not the United States can't really claim anymore to be, the supreme power in the world. I think we are looking at a world that is that has a wider distribution of power, and it's, of course, a lot will hinge on how China will continue to grow and how it will continue to assert itself in the world.
All three of you picked up upon foreign affairs and the international community. How might this election impact US-EU relations, and how might it even impact Malta?
I mean, I don't know if I can go first. I think when it comes to bilateral relations with Malta, I would say that we've always enjoyed a very strong bilateral relationship. I think across administrations, whether there's been changes in government in the United States or in Malta, I think that has remained fairly consistent, and I would imagine that would remain the case. I wouldn't see I wouldn't expect to see a drastic change within the bilateral relationship. But obviously, any aspect of Malta's foreign policy has to be reviewed and assessed in the context of the bigger picture, and the broader EU dynamics and frameworks that are taking place. As George already touched upon, you had the United States being tougher with its NATO allies with regards to defense spending. And again, this was an issue that had, even under the Obama administration, a lot of mechanisms had been put into place to increase the defense commitments of other European partners and allies within the alliance. We've seen the United States being tougher again with regards to the EU, especially with regards to the trade relationship and the tariffs that have been imposed. So it is becoming sort of I would say a little bit more of a contentious, not really contentious relationship, but it is a bit more sort of a more negotiated relationship, if you will, that there is a little bit more, sort of disagreement perhaps along different lines between the United States and its European counterparts. What we've seen as a result of that was, there are those who argue, listen, but it's making both sides across the Atlantic stand their ground and emerge with a relationship that both are happier with, or trying to move towards a relationship that both are happier with. At the same time, what we're seeing is the Europeans trying to be a little bit more autonomous at sort of a political level, and even as well at not just an economic level, but even at a strategic level, which is positive, because you have, if the Europeans are more strategically capable outside the US umbrella, if you will, then that means that there are more reliant partners within the transatlantic frameworks, within the NATO frameworks, but it also means that they are stronger and more independent actors at a European level. And what we're seeing is probably a stronger and a more autonomous EU emerging. So I think that's not a bad thing.
Well, Julia, you asked about Europe and Malta. Now, let me pick on Malta. Perhaps Robert would shed more light on the European dimension. It's very hard to think of a significant change in foreign policy or in bilateral relations between the United States and Malta according to who is elected to office. Let's keep in mind the size of the country, the magnitude of our impact, which is what it is. So we need to keep that in the equation. So usually Malta fits in a Mediterranean dimension. If the United States would somehow shift, towards, for example, giving more importance to its fleet in the Mediterranean, and therefore we might come in, we still need to keep in mind that Malta is a neutral country. And therefore, when it comes to any military alliance or commitment, Malta is a neutral country. We need, however, to mention the fact that just 3 weeks ago, we had the visit of the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, to Malta, which again is something very, very rare. I myself can't remember a previous visit of any Secretary of Defense to Malta. And he didn't come to Malta and return back to the United States. It was part of a tour that included other countries, Middle East, etc., etc. But his visit sparked a number of reactions, as we all know, and SOFA came into place. Okay, the issue of the State of Forces Agreement was raised again on the table, whereas it was something that was discussed years ago, when suddenly it rose to the fore almost immediately. Now, this adds to a sort of friendship agreement that has been signed in 2019 between the United States and Malta. We don't know much about that, but it was a sort of a renewal of friendship. Let's keep in mind that we need the United States to help us securing our status as an island, our status as an island that is, surrounded by the sea and therefore exposed to illegal trafficking, illegal migration, and what have you. And we might not have the sufficient capacity to defend our borders, and the United States might come in to help. So one might think about those types of relationships. But when the Secretary of Defense came, we had an article by the Times of Malta that SOFA could have been an issue on the table. I need to say that we had outright denials by the Prime Minister, by the Minister for Foreign Affairs about this issue. But notwithstanding that, and I think this is significant itself, we had former prime ministers like Dr. Alfred Sant, Dr. Lawrence Gonzi, President Emeritus Mary Louise Calero Preca, actually taking it in public about the issue. They wrote opinion pieces. They were quite vocal about it. So something must have been cooking. We don't know what it is. What worries me now, as a political comment, what worries me is that this was never taken to Parliament, and we don't really know what happened. So, Julia, I'm mentioning this because obviously having a new president might not, in my opinion, have any significant or visible impact on our relations with the United States. But there might be changes in the pipeline. And I wouldn't say those are direct related to the president. The United States has long-term plans in the way it projects its foreign policy. And I would say we fit in part of a bigger Mediterranean dimension. That is it.
I mean, I agree with Georgia, but to add on, I think this has always been something that the United States would have liked to see on the table. I think sort of every 5 to 10 years, we do see a little bit more rhetoric coming out of the US Embassy and sort of that suggestion coming out of the bilateral relationship that Malta might want to reconsider its neutrality. Whenever there's a domestic debate and a domestic political debate with regards to neutrality, the US Embassy sort of does seem to, suggest leanings or suggest sort of positions in a particular direction or not. So I don't think the Americans have ever made it sort of a secret that it would like Malta to reconsider its position of neutrality. But yes, I think we have seen more movement on this than we have in a long time.
I think that one major issue at stake in this election is the issue of trade. And there are fears in Europe that Trump could start a trade war with Europe if he wins the election. He has threatened this a few times. He even claimed that Europe in many ways was worse than China in terms of how it treated the United States. So there have been a lot of signs that he is ready to go and to push the boundaries on this question of trade. And the trade war would be damaging to both the economy of the United States and Europe. So I'm sorry. I thought I switched it off. So if tariffs are imposed, I think the EU stands to lose more, and Trump is aware of this. He's also unhappy with the fact that the European Union has a surplus with the United States in terms of trade of about, meaning that the exports from the EU to the US are much higher than the EU imports from the United States, and he wants to do something about this. I think also the fact that a lot of economists in Europe are saying that the US politics in itself is a serious risk for the European economy, because, and as I think might very likely happen, we could have a contested election outcome, and this could lead to a lot of uncertainty. And we could see street protests by the supporters of the losing side, and there are many. There is a lot of evidence pointing that this could happen, mostly because of the increasing numbers of postal ballots, because of the pandemic. But in any case, I think there is an indication that the uncertainty for several weeks that we may have on the outcome could lead to a lot of problems, even for Europe.
So we've touched up upon US-EU relations and specifically on Malta. On a more general note, How is the US electoral system different from Malta's? And is the Electoral College still relevant nowadays? Dr. Vital Zamit, your mic is muted.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. How is it different? Where it's a completely different electoral system, unlike any other one in the world. Conceived 250 years ago by the founding fathers, with specific intents in mind. When the United States was 1/6 or 1/7 of the size it is today, when transportation was different, when cities and cities and rural areas weren't connected, where states were forming in the East Coast, and the founding fathers wanted to have a system. When I say the founding fathers, I'm referring to Benjamin Harrison, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, that actually conceived the idea of United States breaking away from Britain, and therefore having a declaration of independence, and therefore having a system of electing its own representatives. At the time, the idea was to have two systems within one in parallel with each other, a popular vote, okay, where every vote counts, and an electoral college. And the idea there was to have an equal representation from every state. So a state that has 10 million people and a state that has 200,000 people would have representation, and that is in Senate. Okay, so Senate has 2 representatives from every state in the United States. So California, with 30 million people, has 2 senators. Montana, with 500,000 people, 600,000 people, has 2 senators. Okay, so it's completely different. It's still disputed to the day whether that is fair, and it's definitely not. Now, so I'm giving you an idea of how different that is. Now, here in Malta, we have a single transferable vote based on districts. We used to have a system where it's not the popular vote that counts, but it's the number of elected representatives in each district. Okay, that was abolished in 1987 when the parties came together with an agreement. Now, in the United States, the Electoral College is very much a disputed idea. However, it stays. And what's remarkable is that it has happened 3-4 times that the Electoral College prevails and not the popular vote. And you don't see the country coming out in mass, having a revolution about it. They just accept it. It happened, so to go back to recent history, it happened with Gore in 2000. It happened with Trump in 2016. The difference is that the difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016 was significant. It was, I believe, 2,800,000 votes, almost 3 million people. That's a lot. That's a lot. 3 million people is the combined population of 5 states in the United States alone, combined population. And that's a lot. So what this carries in Julia is not only the way an election is actually decided, but also the way the campaigning is carried out. As we speak in the United States, it's heading towards the actual casting of, 90 million people have already cast their ballot. So 90 million people have already voted in the United States. But you had Biden and Trump in these days campaigning only in what we call the toss-up states, the swing states. And what are these states? These are the states that switch allegiance from one election to another. And given that the electoral vote, the electoral college is a winner takes it all. So if you win California, you win 55 seats. Even if you win by 100,000 votes, you don't get 30 and I get 25. You get the whole of 55. It's a winner take it all. So what happens is that states that are pretty well defined and well set, like New York, that is always Democrat, like Texas, which most of the time is Republican, like California, which is always Democrat, Vermont is always Democrat, you don't go there. The candidates don't go there. So the people that live in these states, in a way, are deprived of having a campaign in their states. Why? Because it's very predictable. The campaign takes place in the states that can actually switch allegiance. So we're talking about Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin. These are the states where the campaign is concentrated. And that's just a fraction of the whole US territory. So you can see, I'm mentioning this because the electoral system, in a way, is creating this unbalance in the way the campaign is carried out, in the way people are represented. And I need to say, I believe there were hundreds, I had the exact number in mind, but it's escaping me at the moment. There were hundreds of attempts to actually remove it through a vote in Congress. None of these succeeded. None of these succeeded. So there were this is not a new debate. This is not a new subject. Many times there has been an attempt to actually eliminate the Electoral College, and none have succeeded.
I think I agree. I think from outside the United States, it seems like a very bizarre and a complicated system. I think, as George mentioned, the founding fathers and the intent of the Electoral College system was to make sure that you didn't have big states, like he mentioned, for example, New York and California, which are larger states, more urbanized states, which have a much larger population than many of the smaller states. I think the concern was that, then it wouldn't matter what the smaller states and the smaller regions or areas or smaller states within the heartland of the country would vote, because they would be outweighed by the larger, more populous states sort of at the flanks and at the coast of the country. So there is an element of check and balance, if you will, in the political system and in the electoral system. Now, I mean, I think those of us outside the United States probably look at it as, why doesn't the check and balance come from Senate and Congress, sort of that those are the ones that are more directly elected and directly represented sort of proportionally within the House and more equally within the Congress, and shouldn't the president be elected by sort of a single national vote? I think it's still a matter of the discrepancy and the anomaly of the national vote and the Electoral College vote not tallying is more of an exception rather than the norm. I think, yes, it's true in the past, 20, 30 years, sort of we've seen more exceptions, because there've been more unique, perhaps, elections with more unique candidates. I think this election will tell us a lot about, how do we understand the Electoral College system and the extent to which it's still relevant within the national political context and reflecting public opinion and the public expectations out of their electoral system. Here in Malta, we had that change in 87 because there was an anomalous result in 81, which resulted in political protest, if you will. And it was a desire and a compromise between the political parties to have the seats in Parliament adjusted to reflect the national vote. That political will has to come from within the political parties as to whether they want that change to take place.
Yes, in my opinion, the Electoral College has outlived its usefulness, because the vote, to some extent, is non-consequential. If you're a Republican and voting in Massachusetts, your vote means nothing. If you are a Democrat voting in a state which is guaranteed to vote Republican, what does your vote mean? Nothing. So voters tend to lose interest. That's why all the focus is on the swing states, and I think the whole system needs to be revisited. There is some drive towards there is a push towards revisiting the system, but there are equally, if not more, stronger lobby against touching the system. Let's not forget that there is no guarantee that the candidate who wins the public vote may not become president. So any system which allows that kind of outcome raises concerns. In fact, 2 out of the last 5 elections were won by candidates who had fewer votes from the general public. So I would say this is not the best system you could have.
So you've mentioned the national vote versus the electoral college vote, and also campaigning. Focusing slightly on this year's candidates, what is either candidate promising as the major issues on their platform?
I mean, if you had to look at many critics of the Trump campaign, many critics are saying there are no campaign issues, sort of as a party platform. I think what the Trump campaign is promising is more of the same, and sort of continuing the policy of making America great again, and continuing on the economic successes that the administration was achieving pre-COVID, and building up the country and the economy in the midst of the pandemic. I think COVID has been central to the electoral campaign, and the nature, if not the campaign, the nature of the campaign and the nature on which issues are being presented. I think historically, if we look at elections within the United States and elsewhere, the priorities tend to be issues like economic well-being and access to healthcare. And these have remained the priorities, and these are aspects that have been very heavily impacted by the pandemic. I think if we look at economic issues, you have the United States, which is very split. You have those who want a smaller government to be less intrusive, and this is the strength of the Republican Party, that it relies on a less involved federal state and leaves much of the political and economic legislative strengths to the states themselves. But you have the business sector, which prefers a small government. You have Democrats who talk more about stronger legislation and providing more access to healthcare, and a fairer access to healthcare, if you will. So obviously these are issues that are going to be dominated by the impact of COVID, especially if not now in the subsequent months, where we're going to be seeing a United States that is going to have to address the ripple effects and the repercussions. You have Trump, who's talked about the fact that the remedy to the pandemic shouldn't be worse and the cure shouldn't be worse than the disease itself. And there is quite a strong drive in support of having a country that remains open, that resists lockdown, that sort of gives people the freedoms that they feel they are entitled to, especially when it comes to things as to whether to wear a mask or not. And you have, I think, the Biden platform, which has very much been much more detailed with regards to policy, but has also been very reactionary to what the Trump administration has done or what the Trump administration stands for. So I think a lot of the campaign is based not so much on the substance of issues, but much more on the character and the soul and the direction of the country and where it sees itself, both as a society and as its place within the international community.
Well, Julia, I think you asked for the main policy proposals. I think as Valentina hinted, if you had to look at what was proposed by the Trump platform 4 years ago, it's pretty much the same. So you have this America first, America should remain the sole subject when it comes to designing policies. That is something which Biden is intending to reverse. Biden wants to reverse this America first. because America First, as we said a few moments ago earlier on in this discussion, America First goes against the idea of having the United States having a global presence in the international arena. The United States giving a speech at the United Nations and be respected for it. That has been lost. And Trump is not the first one to have rallied with that slogan. I'm old enough to remember George Bush, the younger one, running on that platform way back in 2000. Until 9 months into his office, he had September 11. And that completely changed the orientation of the United States foreign policy. Biden intends as well to respect the accords and the agreements on climate change. Let's keep in mind that even though Trump actually withdrew the United States as the first thing he did upon being elected, that actually comes to effect in a few months' time. I believe January of 2021. So with a new president, that can actually be withdrawn if Biden is elected. There is a huge emphasis by the Trump administration on the borders with Mexico and immigration. And what we have seen and what has become a battleground between the two in the past few weeks is actually how to treat people at the border. We have around 500 children that seem to have been disconnected from their parents completely. And it's not clear whether these will ever be reunited with their parents. Now that is unacceptable by any norm of international human rights. That is unacceptable. And that is something which Biden is saying does not really make us stronger. It actually makes us weaker. The United States portrayed as a bully. Biden intends also to actually give the necessary permits of people who have been in the United States for 15 to 20 years sometimes. Some of them have been expelled after having lived for all this time, having children gone to school, having adapted with the language, and they have been expelled back during the Trump administration with the inspections carried out by ICE, the police unit. So these are just a few. When it comes to terrorism, for example, it seems that Trump would not engage by sending troops anywhere in the world, but addressing it by proxy. So using drone technology and wherever having surgical operations without the deployment of US troops. That is slightly contentious as well, because there are areas where, and I'm referring here to the north of Syria, for example, parts of Afghanistan, where the withdrawal of US troops has meant that the signal is sent actually to the enemies of the United States, to come back. So the differences are not significant, Julia. And as a matter of fact, it's a bit of a continuation of what we had in the past 4 years. What I think is something significant for America being the macho country, being the super policeman of the world, I think people give a value to a leader that looks strong. We saw that with Reagan, for example, in 1981. We saw that with Bush in 88. So whenever there are candidates that portray a stronger sense of security, that could come to their advantage. So I wouldn't be surprised that people might see Trump as, let's keep in mind, it was during the Trump administration that actually al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, was much. It was a feather in Obama's cap that bin Laden was captured and eliminated during his presidency, so much it is that the threat of ISIS has been severely diminished under the Trump administration.
Yes, I think Joe Biden is very clearly a liberal internationalist, and if you look at his main advisors, you know, they all have this kind of liberal internationalist approach. So there will definitely be a change of direction and language from that perspective, you know, in terms of foreign policy. Having said this, I think if Trump does get elected, I don't think there is an appetite in the US at the moment to venture into any international military interventions. I mean, even if whoever is elected, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, I think we will see less and less appetite for military interventions abroad. Joe Biden will definitely try to repair his relationships, U.S. relationships with the allies, especially in Europe, and he will also push for sanctions on Russia, which Trump would not do if perhaps in the same way. On climate change, although yes, Trump is definitely against climate change, and at federal level, the U.S. is moving, you know, with its commitment to withdraw from the Paris Accords. But we have to consider the fact that at state level, in many states, they have been preparing for the implementation of the objectives of the climate accord. So despite the direction from the federal level, at state level, they have not been the Paris Accord. I think the United States will be quite prepared to implement the commitments of Paris, because in many states they have already adopted those objectives. But it's very clear that if Trump is elected, he will push for more non-renewable energy. So because, you know, he's skeptic, climate change skeptic, and Joe Biden will reverse this. So he has spoken in favor of the need to have net zero emissions for the United States by 2050, as projected by the Paris Accord.
So remaining on the topic of this year's candidates, some might say that at times the presidential debates got slightly heated. Do you think that these debates affected the candidate's standing?
Debates usually have a resonance on the way people perceive politics, and one should always start where this started from. You know, there's this historical anecdote of the first time that the debates were televised in 1960 between Richard Nixon and JFK, John Kennedy. And that was the first televised ever debate. It was black and white. And Nixon had refused to have any makeup. And he had what we call the 5 o'clock shadow on his face, which made him seem frail and haggard. But actually the people who followed the debate on radio felt that Nixon was much more convincing. And this, when it comes to campaigning and the study of campaigning and the way communication has an impact on debates, this was a historical event, because those who heard the debate on radio felt that Richard Nixon had the upper hand. Those who watched it on television, and there were 3 or 4 debates, felt that JFK, who was slightly younger, but new to the scene, famously called for the torch of a new generation to be passed on, Eventually, JFK won the election. Subsequently, we had a number of instances where the candidate who had the best rhetoric shown out during the debates. We had quite a few of these, but I wouldn't say it's entirely a deciding factor. To come back to actually to this, I'll be honest with you. I watched the second debate and in its entirety, and it put me off a lot. It was very void of any policy content. It was almost mostly personal attacks to and from, and it's shameful. Probably the best thing that came out of the second debate was that the female moderator, I think, did an exceptional job. She actually carried the day, I believe. But nothing more than that. Now, did this leave an impact? I haven't seen any studies that actually show whether the past debates had any impact. All the forecasts for quite a few months now, I mean, this has been consistent, actually, since the primaries were around. So when you had the primaries for the Democratic Party, you used to have the projections of the candidates and then the projection of the candidate versus Trump, always. So when you had, for example, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, you would have how they fared against each other and then how they fared against Trump. There was one particular statistic that always came out, which is Biden was always beating Trump. That's until today. So we're having this debate a few hours before the outcome. That's until today. And I need to stress this because I've seen this already 4 years ago. 4 years ago, the results were very clear all throughout. I remember actually, and I was commenting this on media, on public media in Malta. There were the exit polls that were carried out in the Pacific, in Vanuatu. So Vanuatu is American territory in the Pacific, and they vote first. So geographically, they vote first. And we had these early projections that this will be a Clinton sweep. Okay? But those who spent the whole night, I mean, watching it unfolding, you could see that it was never a Clinton sweep, and that Trump had actually campaigned very well in what we were referring to earlier as the toss-up states. So, Julia, I think, and I mentioned this earlier on. To me, Biden looks frail. So here you have a 77-year-old candidate, the oldest. Reagan ran for president when he was 70 years old. Trump is now 74. Biden is 77. Now, how is that important? It is. It is. And if in the United States, negative campaigning plays an extremely important role. Negative campaigning, you portray your adversary not for what he stands for, but actually, passing on the negative message implied by your adversary. And you could see that Biden sometimes is forgetful. He is forgetting places where he's campaigning. He actually had a slip up a few days ago that we had 4 years presidency of George and Jill, his wife, actually, hinted it was Trump. These things actually matter. These things matter. And that's why I would not be surprised that when it comes to actually projecting strength, and you start projecting strength of your country by having a strong leader, I think Biden is lagging behind in this sense. So we'll see. Again, to this hour, all forecasts are that Biden will win the election, even in these key states, even in these battleground states. But I wouldn't be surprised that we would actually have surprises.
I think you asked about the debates, and I think what's important to keep in mind is how the nature of the electoral campaign and the nature of the media and political communication is changing, in the sense that I think the debates are still very important. I think they still give us a platform in which we can see the candidates interacting with one another, but I think they are probably less decisive as they may have been during previous election campaigns. I think what was interesting about this year's campaigns, this year's debates, was the fact that you had the first debate, which was a complete disaster, sort of, especially as somebody watching the debate. I don't know if you watched it, Julia, but I mean, it was, you get a headache watching it, because the extent to which you had Trump sort of jumping in and interrupting. You had neither side was really properly answering a question. You had the moderator who was struggling. So what I think most of the commentators and most of the public felt was that they didn't get any essence or any substance out of the campaign, out of the debate. The second debate was famously cancelled because Trump had been diagnosed with COVID. There were reservations about holding the events together and so on. The third debate was a little bit more civilized. The moderator had a mute button. So you had the candidates being a little bit more civilized with one another. Probably there wasn't a lot of substance that came out of it, but you had them interacting in a more statesmanly way. And the way I saw it was, when I saw some polls after the actual debates, you had, many of the projections being more favorable towards Biden. But looking at it from a Trump point of view, I think in his first campaign, he was pandering towards his base and the electorate that likes Trump for what he is, and likes Trump for his demeanor and the fact that he will, call out other politicians, that he's anti-establishment, and so on. I think in the third debate, probably what he appealed to more was the voters, or the traditional Republican voters, who have reservations about Trump because of his demeanor rather than because of the actual policy or substance. So I think sort of the way I saw it in these two debates, he was appealing to different target audiences of his, if you will. I think what's even more interesting about this campaign then is beyond the traditional debates and the traditional platforms and rallies, especially because they've been so difficult to hold because of the pandemic. And I think what we see is with the Biden campaign, it's been much more diversified, and it's been interesting to see how he has been sort of like a compromise candidate, I think, within the Democratic Party. And as George mentioned, he is the one who was seen as having a strongest chance to win an election against Trump. But you have all these other fringes of the Democratic Party that have rallied around, I think, and then campaigned and targeted different sectors and different audience members. So you've had like Kamala Harris interviewing celebrities on social media. You've had AOC, chatting with younger voters on gaming platforms. So they've really, I think, intensified and diversified the nature of their outreach and looked, beyond the traditional platforms like debates to look at the wider outreach that they can get through different social media platforms.
No, in my opinion, of course, a presidential debate is very interesting to watch. It's very good for media statistics, but I think they do not really have an effect on the outcome of the election. I don't think people are watching presidential debates on TV so that they can compare the two candidates on their merits. And I've seen several studies by political scientists who have concluded that that people will already have decided on their favorite candidate and how they will vote before they actually watch the presidential debates. If we look at the first debate, I mean, the way Donald Trump was interrupting Joe Biden all the time, and also by the way he refused to denounce the white supremacists. I think a lot of people were shocked by that. But and in fact, studies have indicated that at least from voters' perception, that his performance was very poor in that first debate. But that doesn't mean that although Biden won that debate, doesn't mean that he will win the election. I think that the debates have very little impact on how people actually vote. And this has been a trend for being put forward by political scientists, and for quite a few years now. And this year, even more so. I think they are indicating that that the TV debates have little impact.
So many people, both in the US and also internationally, are currently nervously waiting election results. Do you think that we'll know the winner soon after voting closes?
Depends. I think it depends how close the race is and in which states. So as we've been talking about, it's a race that is probably decided by a number of swing states and a sort of a handful of states. I think it's states like, Florida, which will be one to watch. I think the one that I will probably be watching most closely is Pennsylvania. And looking at states like, Michigan and some of the other smaller states. And it depends how clear their result is. And I think what makes the difference is not just how close the result is in those states, but how those states are tabulating and counting the early votes. So, as we know, there've been the management and the logistics of voting takes place at a state-to-state level. So they all have different systems, they all have different ballots, they all have different rules and regulations with regards to how the votes are counted. So you have, some states where they can and have already been counting the early votes. So those will be known once voting closes as well. There are others which are only allowed to count the early votes after the election. So it depends how close and how tight the race is over there and what the exit polls are telling us over there. And it depends if these are states that are going to have a determining factor on sort of tossing up, getting towards that 270, which a candidate would need to clinch the electoral vote. I mean, I think this election more than any other, we've seen talk about, the time that it's going to take to get to a result, the possibility of an even tie, and then what legislative repercussions that is going to have in how the presidency would be decided if that worst case scenario were the case. I think the more concerning factor of all this is if the result is contested, and if you have one candidate announcing victory too early on, and how that will be, and how that will affect the political and the cultural sort of tensions, I would say, and economic repercussions of those tensions within the country and outside.
Yes, I think as Valentina said, so all these considerations come in for those who will be spending the night watching. I would suggest looking at the headquarters of each and every candidate. I believe the Trump HQ will be in the Trump Tower, New York. Biden's headquarters is significant. He will be in Pennsylvania, and a very much needed state to win the election. He will be in Philadelphia. And that's where the team will be monitoring how each and every state goes. My wish is that, not only mine, but obviously, is that the result is clear. No candidate, it has been convention up to now that no candidate will announce before the other one has conceded. That has always been the practice. with Trump, you can never say. Trump is different in every way, and I'm sure that he might wish to play some sort of conspiracy card if he feel that he can actually do that. Let's keep in mind that the way even the justice system in the United States plays out has a political element too. So if we go back to the recount that was called by the Gore camp in Florida in 2000, that was actually decided by courts, and the judge was a leaning Republican at the time. So yes, politics plays all the way in every level. I hope that the result is clear. I hope that, well, we need that. I think the United States needs a new chapter. I would personally be quite happy to see this new chapter unfolding for various reasons. We mentioned this discussion. And well, I'm looking forward. I wouldn't be surprised that the status quo will actually be repeated and embraced. So I wouldn't be surprised in that. And a president in his second term might actually be much more audacious because you don't have the worry that you will be somehow not re-elected another time. So the next 4 years, if we're going to have another Trump administration, be prepared for a number of perhaps forceful situations, which it's just my way or the highway. At least that's what I'm expecting.
In my opinion, I think whatever the outcome of the election, I think many will question the legitimacy of the vote. I think it will be close, and I think there is a deep mistrust in the system. So I think in the past it was more difficult to question the process, but this time it is, because there are so many more postal votes than in past elections, and I think this will be decisive. And of course, the count for postal votes can take a lot of time. It's very lengthy. So if that becomes decisive, then we're looking at a very long delay for the result, and there might be legal complications and possibly a court decision. So my expectations are that there will be the system will be questioned. The outcome the legitimacy of the outcome will be questioned. And that will have an impact in itself. I mean, it will have a huge impact on the financial markets. So there's a huge cost on this, and especially, and it will be even worse if after this a long process and legal dispute, still there must still be a delay in one side conceding. I can see this happening.
So to close off today's discussion, you were mentioning, it was mentioned before, how the votes might be quite close this time. Who do you think will win?
Well, do you expect, what are you waiting for? An answer from the heart or from the mind? Because they're not all.
It can be a bit of both.
They're not always in sync. Well, let me tell you, in another interview, I made this statement, and I really believe it. I really wish to see the White House again occupied by a president that gives it back its decorum, gives it back its presidential status. I mean, we need someone that acts presidential, male or female. Now, in this case, the candidates are male. Again, I wouldn't be surprised that if there's a Biden win, we would be seeing a female president very soon, but that's a hunch. I would be happy to see that personally. We need a president that acts in a presidential way. That has been missing for the past 4 years. So that's about conduct. I also would like to see a president that takes the initiative on a number of policy goals that are important for humanity. I cannot myself. I have 2 small kids, and I look at their future apart from mine. I cannot look at a world leader that is in complete denial of what is a scientifically proven phenomenon, which is that the world is heating up. So I can never support that. Okay. So my heart would say, and my mind, but would say I'd wish to have a new page, and that would be represented by Joe Biden. But who I think I will win, I have hinted a number of times in the discussion that it's not a fait accompli. Definitely it's not. I take no consolation in seeing 10 months of forecasts that have always repeated the same thing, and I'm open for surprises.
I think if we look at, after 2016, I think everyone's been much warier this time because, we had sort of a surprise win for Trump because the polls had been favorable towards Hillary Clinton. So I think the way I see it this time is I think there have been greater measures taken to try and have polls that are more accurate, polls that are more realistic. What we're seeing is wider gaps between the Trump advantages over the Biden, advantages over Trump. There are many less undecided voters. I think, so I think there's an element of greater caution in the way these polls are being projected and presented. I think Biden does have more paths to office and more paths to 270 and 270 plus, but Trump still retains that possibility, and there are still sort of ways for him and certain states for him to win that will, if he defends his last result successfully, he still has the possibility of getting elected. So whilst I think there is a more of a possibility of a Biden win, I think like everyone else, I'm bracing myself for a surprise and the possibility of a Trump re-election. What I would like to see out of after this election is more tolerance and more compassion, and I would hope that a second-term Trump administration might be a bit more moderate. We might have a bit more moderation coming out of Congress as well, that might restrain the types of policy that might come out of the White House. What I would want to see is a change in tone. I think, when certain tones and certain behavior is projected at an elite level, then it tends to be mimicked at a public level. And that is where it is more concerning, I would say. So I would hope that there is a change in tone and a greater sense of tolerance within US and international communities.
Yes, I would like to follow up on what Valentina has just said on this change of tone, because I think this is a very serious issue. There is a lot of misinformation, and I think the main challenge for voters is how to outsmart the misinformation that keeps flowing, from different sources, and then encouraged by some politicians, now Trump included. So there is a certain environment where experts are held in disdain. So when you see hostility towards experts, towards academics, towards members of the civil service, even members of the foreign service, whether if you're an expert, your expertise doesn't count, and this has created an environment of disdain, which is very, very unfortunate. I don't see how this will change in the immediate future, but I think this should be a huge priority in the short to medium term. it takes a long time to build confidence, but I think there must be some kind of effort by different stakeholders to push in this direction.
So, on behalf of KSU, I would like to thank you all for joining us this evening. I believe it was a very interesting and informative discussion. Up next, we'll be speaking to the US Chargé d'Affaires, Mr. Wendy Green. Thank you.